Good morning and welcome to today's webcast. My name is DJ Netz and I am the current past president of the ATD Cascadia chapter. And welcome to our webcast. Today we're going to explore effective decision making in diverse groups. And our presenter today is Ursina Teuscher, who is a decision coach and an author and a friend to our chapter for several years. During this presentation, it's an interactive presentation, so if you have questions for Ursina, then type them into the chat feature, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and as the questions come in, I'll present them to Ursina, and she can respond to you in real time. So Ursina, let's begin, and tell us a little bit about your role as a decision coach.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm actually really excited about talking about this topic that I'm really passionate about, decision coaching or helping people to make better decisions. And yeah, as a coach, I often help either individuals or teams, organizations to come to better decisions if they are difficult and if they may be difficult to come to by consensus.
And that's what I'm really looking forward to, is the advice and the frameworks and tools that you're going to share today about how to build consensus and how to get more equitable group decision making.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, so I would like to start us out actually with a story that has been quite influential to the art and science of decision making. This is the Phoenix River Delta, a very dry climate, as you know. But as so often in deserts, when there is rain, there can be quite a lot of it, and the water, the ground does not have the capacity to absorb masses of water very quickly, and so there can be quite destructive floods, flash floods that leave a wake of destruction behind them and are really costly to a community when it comes to cleanup and repair and rescue missions. And so back in the 70s already, Congress approved a project, a dam controlling system that was supposed to help with these floods. And this was a big project and was supposed to help with the metro as well as valley flooding, and it was called the Orm Dam, that whole project. And something that the plan didn't really specify, I guess, was that, or didn't really take into account enough, was that there was an Indian reservation, the Yavapai reservation, that would have been completely flooded by that dam construction, and the entire reservation, including tribal farm, would have been under that water then. And so the Yavapai fought that project for more than 10 years, and they were actually not the only ones fighting. It turned out there were environmental concerns too. There was a bald eagle habitat that would have been destroyed, and there were recreational concerns like a wonderful trail system that would have just also disappeared under the water there. And eventually, after all these delayed construction or not happening construction work, there was a study group hired under a psychologist, Curtis Brown, and he actually brought together all the interested parties, also outside experts, and what he started was to really actually find out what the concerns were of people. He gathered these different interest groups and found out that the concerns were not just about the valley and metro flooding, but also about the environmental aspects and the Yavapai and all that. And he, based on the concerns that they grouped together, they called for new proposals to build different kinds of dams or different kinds of dam systems. And they got a lot of bids for that were, and several of those, I'm showing you here an oversimplified version of the results. Several of those new incoming projects were actually better on every dimension than the original projects. So you can see here individual or independent ratings of different projects. You can see the Orm Dam as a red line there that was doing okay on valley and metro flooding concerns, but obviously not okay in the recreational, environmental, and Yavapai concerns. And you can see two other dam systems that scored higher on almost all of those. And the new Woodell system is the one that eventually was implemented. And that is actually what we have now in that region. And the Yavapai actually celebrate their victory over the Orm Dam until this day every year.
Huh.
And I also see that kind of as a celebration of a good decision-making process. Because once somebody came in and actually facilitated that process and started with figuring out what the concerns are and then looking for better options, they were able to come up with a surprising winner contribution. Mm-hmm. And what this shows, this whole example shows us is that this kind of a criteria-focused approach can lead to surprising amounts of both innovation and agreement. And even in controversial decisions, and I think that the agreement maybe partially comes from the fact that this decision is actually objectively better with more innovation, but I also find that people are willing oftentimes to make compromises if they see that there is a fair process of a decision being made, so that that itself can have a powerful effect. And I want to, based on this example here, I want to now tell you a little more generally how we can think about decisions in these components. So based on the example, let me show you a more general framework of how to make decisions so that you can really apply that to any kind of decision that you may be faced with. What the example showed here is, and I will talk about each of those steps in more details, what it shows you is that it's really important to start out by clarifying the criteria before then exploring options and evaluating options. We oftentimes approach decisions kind of in the other way around. We look at options, we may have a problem and there may be one option that seems to be a solution, like the Orm Dam, and then we think, should we do this or not? But that's not the right way to approach a decision, right? We need to first figure out what even matters here. Why is this a problem, and what would be different ways of solving it, and then actually evaluating it. And so let me show you for each of those steps a little bit how best practices as to how to go through that process. First, starting with the criteria clarification, and that's exactly the step that we oftentimes skip altogether. It's not an easy step, but it can make a big difference in your decisions. So finding out what the evaluation criteria actually are for your decision. The question here is what do we want, and who in a group decision, who is we, right? Who are even the stakeholders here? In the case of the Orm Dam, the Yavapai were very much stakeholders, but they had not been considered as such at first, probably, or not enough, or their power had been underestimated. And so that's an important question here to think about who is actually involved in this decision, who is impacted, and what are their interests, and what do we want to achieve, what is the problem we want to solve here, and to really bring all those concerns, all those factors together.
So before you move on, let me ask a question. Is this also a category that might include what many business people might call key performance indicators?
Yes, that's actually a really good connection. Yes, I would say that. Yeah, that's a good parallel to that. Yeah. And one way to gather these criteria, a simple way, but a really effective way, is to bring people together in a room and start with a brainstorming. That you could do that in different ways also, as in an online format, by just gathering data from people. But if you can bring people together, and if there's a decision that involves a lot of people, that you could have representatives of different stakeholders come together and have them bring every one of their concern to the table in a sort of a brainstorming at first, and then gather all these criteria together to come up with factors that matter. That's not as easy a process as it may sound right now, but I can just, as kind of a shortcut to that, you can, if you have some sort of a public policy decision, for example, there are often typical categories that matter. There are oftentimes economic categories, there are social categories, environmental categories that you could all see, for example, with that Orm Dam decision. But those tend to crop up in a lot of decisions, and you can kind of look for those and gather your oral criteria along those factors. I will also later on show you a decision that that shows you more of those categories in an example. So once you have that criteria set, try to get your group to commit to that, to pre-commit to that criteria set. Before you even evaluate options, think about that question, can we, if you see all the criteria, can we agree that those are the ones that matter? And can we agree that if we find an option that scores highly on all of those, we will pick that option?
Do you have advice or a way to prioritize this criteria?
That's another good question. You mean how to weigh them?
Uh-huh.
Yes, that's a question that you could address either in a democratic way. You could actually have people give weights to different criteria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or you could have, if you have a decision maker that eventually needs to decide, you could have that person assign weights. But
very good.
Yeah, that's an important step actually. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a nice way to start out, just collecting criteria, and then decide how much weight to give them.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's important first to have everything on the table that matters before shooting it down and saying, well, it's not important.
Right.
It's better to give it a low weight later on than to not include it as a criterion at first.
Very good.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So once you have that criteria set and you have a commitment to it, that's a good moment to start exploring options or exploring more options. Because you may already have some solutions in mind, but always look for more and better solutions. It's always, there's a lot of research actually showing that even if you think you found a good solution, there's almost always a better one out there if you just keep thinking. But the problem is that we don't know that yet before we start thinking longer and harder than what's comfortable, right? So in a group situation, you can actually make use of it. The more diverse your group is, the more you can take advantage of that diversity to call for different kinds of proposals and bids. If you have interested parties, engage them in that search for solutions or creation of solutions, because people who don't agree with your initial proposal might be more creative, bringing up better solutions or a combination of solutions. So there's oftentimes something that's possible if you get people to think. And if you make them understand that, actually get back to the criteria set, if you make them understand that these are our criteria, if you find us a solution that fulfills those, we may be able to implement that. So that's a very motivating way to get people to think.
Mm-hmm.
And you may involve experts in this process or just interested parties, depending on the question here. And so once you have those options, you may screen them according to your criteria, but then eventually you want to have some systematic way to evaluate them. And for that, I will show you an example of how that can be done with a relatively complex decision. The basic structure, though, is to make a decision table with all your criteria as column headers and all your options as row headers. That is the way you want to think about this, and keep that basic structure in mind while we look at a little bit of a more complex example. The example here is a more local and more recent one in history than one from the Orm Dam. This is a project that what county was it? I forget. But anyway, within Oregon there was a project to create a new power line between Oceanside and Tillamook. And my colleague Simon Parati had actually facilitated that process and was working with me there on facilitating a decision facilitating a participatory process to decide between those different power lines that were suggested here. So here on this image you can see the different power lines that would have cut through partially public land, but also private lands and farmland, and would of course make an impact on wherever it was actually conducted. There would be people affected by that. So there was public involvement in that decision, but it's not a straightforward thing to ask people to vote on something like this, right? So I want to show you this. Don't worry, you don't need to actually read the small font here. But I will zoom in on parts of it throughout this, explaining it to you. But what it is here, this is a voting ballot that was handed out to people in a large color, like it was this kind of size color printout that people got in a public meeting. And it has a lot of information on it, and also at the bottom serves as an actual voting ballot. And I will walk you through it, because I think it's a really nice example to show you how voting does not have to be just a yes or no, crossing a box kind of thing. What you can see in the bottom is the list of proposed alternatives. So this is kind of your decision table down there. You can see different routes, and in the as columns you can see different evaluation criteria. And those are here grouped into, as I mentioned before, social, environmental and economic categories here. Within the social, there's several ones here, or two. There are property effects, visual impacts, and there's a reliability concern of the new power line that you want to not to break down as often with thunderstorms and all that. And yeah, so you have these different sub-categories here, and you also have a way to measure those. For example, social visual impacts, you can count the number of unique land owners affected as an example. So there are all these examples of how to measure that. And then this comes to your question. In this case, people could actually assign importance weights for each criterion. So they would look at those criteria and say, okay, social is maybe not as important for me as economic. Let's give it a number here, and they could give it a number from 1 not so important to 10 very important.
So there's a way to account for that relativity.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it was really democratic. Just everybody gets to weigh in, whoever shows up at that meeting. Yeah. And then you can see on the voting ballot there are facts immediately about those. Let's see if we can zoom in here. Those are the facts that the people were able to see. As an example, for the visual effects again, there's the actual number of landowners that people could see here, who were affected. So there is a lot of information that people could take in, and just based on that information,
they can see the proportional impact.
Yep, exactly.
Instead of just whoever's the loudest voice.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, yes. And then it was still up to them to give a subjective judgment, and I think that's actually an important thing to realize. Eventually the decision is going to be subjective. That's what decisions are, right? We want to make a call between, is this good or bad? And everybody could then decide, yeah, okay, so there are going to be on route E3, there will be 14 property owners affected. Is this good or bad for me, right? And they can assign a value. They would cross one of those bullets, colored bullets. 1 would be bad, 5 would be good, and 3 would be neutral. So they would really vote on the quality of each proposal on each of those criteria. Here you can see the overall again. So there are all these different things to vote about. So you wouldn't just vote for one route, but you would vote on how well does this route do on this criterion. And eventually there will be somebody else, as in we in this case, calculating which route was then the winner based on these criteria. Right? So you can see where this is going. You get a total score for each route by multiplying the weight for each of the criteria, each of the columns, with each of the ratings that we got here. And the nice thing about this kind of total score is that it's easy to understand how we calculated it, and it's also easy to see that that's actually a fair process, right? You could still try to vote strategically, definitely, but that would kind of feel like cheating probably in this process. And I think it is easy for people to see how to make this a fair process, and that whichever one was the winner, there was probably a good reason for it, even if it was not the one that they would have preferred personally.
So the procedure does control a little, most of the bias, but are you saying that there still is an opportunity for some bias in this
Yes,
process?
there definitely is. There's opportunity for bias, or there is an opportunity for somebody, if you are a landowner, for example, you could just give sort of dishonest ratings on, or say, or you could just, it wouldn't even be necessarily dishonest. You could say that all of these things are bad, but if you're a reasonable person, there would be maybe some dishonesty in that, right?
Right.
It wouldn't feel quite like the way to go about it. So yeah, there's a room for bias. There's room for cheating on the system, but I think there is much more of an incentive not to do that.
The power of the collective.
Yeah. Yes, and also there is a power of reason, and actually there is also research showing that if you do something like that, there is a lot more agreement between people. You don't get that kind of polarization between two controversial solutions, because people are not really, they're not scoring one of the routes. They are scoring each route on each of the criteria, right? That is actually a substantial difference. In that case, you really focus on the criteria that matter, and there may be disagreement between how much you think something matters or how much you think something doesn't matter. But it's much more likely that you will end up on a reasonable, similarly reasonable conclusion than your neighbor, right?
Very good.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to sum it up again, you remember those 3 steps, right? Start with the criteria, and involve all parties, or as much as you can, all parties to develop already a complete set of criteria, get already agreement on the criteria. And then search for more and better options, call for proposals, call in bids based on the criteria, and then evaluate options along the criteria. And you can really use decision tables as voting ballots. You can do that in smaller, less complex decisions, of course, too. But it really helps getting that a systematic judgment from people.
So we got a question that came in. I have a question, but I do want to, before we talk about our questions, this decision-making table and that procedure, is it described in your book?
Yes, it is actually. Yeah. Yes.
And if you want more detail about a deeper dive on how to compose a decision-making table, what will they get from the book?
They get, so the book is mainly geared towards personal decisions. The same process that I showed here is also really useful for your own decisions. You can think about your criteria as well in this kind of a setting. And yeah, you get examples of decision tables. There's also a little bit more in the book about uncertainty, how to deal with uncertainty, and in that case, working with a different tool like decision trees that you would, or probability trees that you would hook onto a table. So there's a little bit more of that in the book too.
Good.
Yeah.
So that question is targeted for Tammy. Tammy asked, are there handouts or templates of the decision table that we can download? So I think
there are actually quite a few templates on my website. If you want to go to the one that's on
TeuscherCoaching.com.
Yeah, there's a tab that's I think called Free Resources or something, and you can find templates there that are. Some of them are Excel spreadsheets actually that are useful in group decisions. Also, do contact me. I'm happy to also share with you some more. There's some more tools that are helpful for groups. For example, there's an Excel sheet that we use for facilitation where you can plug in different votes for different people.
Terrific.
And also software that we've done with a little app that we've done with colleagues that I'm happy to share. That's kind of in a beta mode, but it's useful for a group decision where you can plug in votes and get collective.
So our next question is from Heather, and she asks, does this process take into account the knowledge and expertise of some of the decision makers? And hang on, let me get back to it. And her part 2 of her question, is there risk of going with a more costly or less efficient process because of input from those that may not have a certain threshold of knowledge? So is there a risk if there's some of the people voting aren't as informed as others?
Yes. I think that is a risk of democracy, definitely. I think we all agree that there are disadvantages of involving everybody. If you are a decision maker who could otherwise just go with an expert and do that, there can be moments for that. I do think, though, that we shouldn't underestimate the way people vote if they can make an informed decision. I do believe that most people are actually reasonable enough to make an informed decision, and I believe that we should trust people more to make that good call if we give them an opportunity to do that, rather than just presenting them with options that they consider bad in the first place, right?
So let me throw you a curveball here. So are feelings considered data points?
Yes, I would say so, yes. Feelings, that's a good question, and I'm hoping I'm not misinterpreting it here, but
well, in your example, of the electrical line and property owners, there could be some powerful feelings.
yes, absolutely. Yes, feelings, I think, have absolutely a place in a decision. You have to be aware of your feelings in order to make rational decisions, and they come in if I want to show you this again here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place in a decision for facts here, and then there's a place where you make that, which can be an emotional judgment, or at least the emotions come into that to make a judgment of whether this is good or bad, right? I think what is important is to kind of tease them apart as a process. The fact gathering should still be somewhat independent of those emotions.
So here's another question that came in. What are your tips to deal with opposing people who are demonstrating strong feelings such as anger or resistance?
Yeah, I would use a process like this one to actually work around that as much as possible, because while people are in each of those steps, while people are, for example, bringing together their criteria, that's a way to express, there's a way to express your anger on a post-it note saying that this should be concern, this should be, the reason for my anger should be part of this decision. And
as a facilitator, you give permission
yeah,
and some space for that to happen.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different way to express it than to sabotage an eventual decision that somebody has made. Yeah.
A question that I have is certainly in business settings, and many decisions involve multiple departments, or what we call cross-functional decisions. Mm-hmm. That might involve production and marketing and product management and finance and human resources. And so you have all these different and sometimes competing resources and viewpoints around the table. So how does, when one has to operate politically, mm-hmm, to get a good decision made and to move something forward, do you have any advice for that, to get as many of those people to the table as possible?
Yeah, in general, I would just involve them as early in the process as possible, in a genuine way, right? This is not a process that I would recommend if you already know what you want to do and you are the decision maker and you want to get buy-in from your people. That is not the process here, right? If you want to be genuine about involving people in your decision, involve them early on, before you even know what the best solution would be, right? To really start with, as I said here, with clarifying the criteria. And yeah.
Terrific. We have another question from Jenny. And she asked, have you experienced different reactions to this model based on cultural differences or different heritages?
I have to say that I wouldn't really be able to say too much to that. I have experienced cultures as in European cultures and here, mm-hmm, and there I have not seen too much difference between them. I've seen the model successfully work in both, but I also realize that those are not as different maybe as cultures.
Anecdotally, this model scales across cultures though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. As far as I know the cultures, yes. Yeah.
Great.
those. Yeah.
Let's look at another question. In a participatory public process where elected officials ultimately decide, what buy-in of those electeds about the process and considering the resulting recommendations is obtained up front?
Can you help me understand the question?
Let's break this down. Let's unpack it. What buy-in of those electeds about the process, recommendations is obtained up front? So is this how much power we might project on these leaders and decision makers?
Maybe.
So, going back to the decision-making table, or prioritizing the criteria, ultimately there might be a situation where someone in charge is going to say these three criteria are the most important.
Yeah.
So how does that affect the rest of the group?
That's a good, I think an important caveat there. And if a decision is really difficult, and if you don't manage to come up with some kind of a winner that beats all those, if you end up having to decide between two options where there's a trade-off, depending on how you weigh your criteria, right? You can actually have a lot of power by being the one who decides how much weight to give each of those criteria, and that is a problem. Or I guess that's where you really have to decide how democratic you want this process to be. If you want to give people the power to weigh in on how important the criteria are. Yeah.
Interesting. And again, it's nice connection here because Betsy is from Tillamook County.
Oh, right, okay.
So what if the elected ultimately ignore what the process shows?
And that can happen, yes. And I think in this case, I'm not even actually sure what eventually happened with those results. And that can be, and I have also seen, by way of collaborating with Simon Parati that I've mentioned before, I've seen that there can be some resistance from the official, from the people who are making the decision eventually, if they have that power, that there can be some reluctance to having a participatory decision process, because then it will be harder to just do what you want anyway, right? If you have all this data showing how why some options are more popular than others, it can be more difficult to just ignore that and go ahead with what you wanted in the first place.
And part of the response to this, and I know we do this in business settings a lot, is sometimes you have to coach people to trust the process and actually objectify the process. Look, we went to the effort to have an inclusive process, and so we have a high confidence in the decision that we arrived at.
Yeah, and this is definitely a way to also show your work, right? To show that you did put in that effort of making a fair and participatory decision. It can be difficult to get people to trust that maybe up front, but hopefully once they have experienced it, they will trust you more for the next process. That's what I would hope. But yeah.
Terrific. Good. Well, this has been extremely helpful information, very vivid examples, and I appreciate you sharing all of this. Ursina's website is teuscherconsulting.com, Teuscher
coaching, sorry.
coaching.com, sorry. And again, there's some great resources and very valuable tools that she offers there. We want to thank you very much for joining us this month for this webcast. And we're looking forward to our next time.
Yeah, thank you so much also for the great questions. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.